Hi, my name is Ashley Quick, and I'm with the Project Success Resource Center. Today's webinar is Writing IEP Goals Aligned to Grade Level Content Connectors. First, we'll talk about what are content connectors, why do we use them, and how they can be useful for students. Then we'll get into unpacking content connectors in order to make them accessible to write IEP goals. And lastly, we'll get to IEP goal writing itself. I'll follow up at the end with just a few additional resources for you as well. The Indiana Resource Network is a series of resource centers that provides services and supports to educators of students with disabilities. Project Success is just one of those resource centers, but if you have an interest in learning more about any of the resource centers, you can look at the IDOE website, type in IRN for Indiana Resource Network, and that'll bring up a list of all those resource centers that you see there, as well as a description of what each one can do for you. For Project Success, you can find additional information and resources on our website, which is www.projectsuccessindiana.com. You'll click on that link in the upper right-hand corner, Resources, and that will bring you to pretty much any information you might need to find on our website. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about ESSA and IEP goal writing and how these two things come together. IEP goal writing under ESSA means that we are working to align to grade level standards. In some cases, for students with more significant disabilities, this means working to align the IEP goals to alternate grade level standards, which are Indiana's content connectors. We're also going to be looking at working to connecting present levels of academic achievement and functional performance to IEP goals. Identifying access points and barriers, that's what we're going to be doing through the unpacking process. We'll look a little bit at specially designed instruction, and lastly, progress monitoring, and how all of these elements come together through ESSA to be a part of a well-written, measurable annual goal. First, let's talk about Content Connectors 101. Content connectors, as I mentioned, they're Indiana's alternate academic standards. They're not meant to be easier versions of the academic standards. They're more meant to be condensed versions of those standards. Essentially, what they do is highlight the knowledge and the skills necessary for a student to reach learning targets at each grade level and then move on past that. Something that's important to know, all content connectors are important for instruction for students. They all have the right to be exposed to the content that's within those content connectors, but not all content connectors will show up on the assessment. So when we're thinking about how much time to spend on instructing each content connector, it's important to remember that not all of them will show up on the assessment. We'll look in a minute here about some resource documents that will help you know whether a content connector is considered high priority or not. So here's just a brief overview. Who are the content connectors for? Students with significant intellectual disabilities. That's really another way of saying it would be sort of that 1% that we hear about. What are they? Again, Indiana's alternate academic standards. When should we be using content connectors? Content connectors show up all over the place. Teachers will use them as they're planning their lessons. The content connectors will show up in the instruction as they're actually developing and delivering the instruction to students. IEP goals, that's today's focus, and they'll also show up on the IM assessment as well. Where should these content connectors be used? In the student's least restrictive environment. And you'll see that there's an asterisk there, which is not necessarily a physical location. So when we're thinking about the least restrictive environment, there are more options than a general education classroom or a self-contained setting. Why? Why do we have content connectors? Broadly speaking, it's because we're having higher expectations for all students, especially those students with more significant needs. And those higher expectations come both from ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and just from more and more growing body of research that shows that students with significant needs are capable of a lot more than we've given them credit for in the past. And we want to make sure that we're exposing them to this content so that they have the chance, the opportunity to be able to learn and grow from that. Lastly, how? How can we possibly bring in all these content connectors into our instruction and into our IEP goals? We'll talk just briefly about how you will work through balancing both academic skills and functional skills within your day. You'll prioritize, which I mentioned earlier, by looking at some resource documents that will help you know which content connectors to spend more time on. They may have a bit higher priority based on how often they appear on the assessment. And lastly, you'll work to infuse functional skills into academic content and vice versa, really maximizing your time with the students you have. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner, we have a link to another webinar that we did called A Guide to Content Connectors. If you need more information about the who, what, when, where, why of content connectors, that would be a great resource for you. Today, we're going to keep going. This is one of the reference documents I mentioned earlier. This document will come in handy when you are writing IEP goals because it shows on the left-hand side the Indiana Academic Standard for whatever grade level you're looking at. And then on the right-hand side, it shows the coordinating content connector, the content connector that is aligned to that Indiana Academic Standard. This comes in handy to know, one, what the expectations are in the general education classroom, and two, to be able to know how does that content connector differ from the Indiana Academic Standard? What have we possibly removed or condensed out of the Indiana Academic Standard to make it more accessible for students who are utilizing the content connectors? There are links to all of these resources, both hyperlinked into the PowerPoint presentation for today's webinar, as well as on Project Success website. This is an additional resource document. The content connectors that are listed on these resource documents are the same. They're just formatted a bit differently, but they all contain the same content connectors. In this version, what we're calling the vertical alignment, we have one version that is a K through 5, and then another version that is a secondary version where you can see the development and progression of the content connectors across grade levels. This is another document that is quite useful when thinking about what kinds of skills you'll be targeting in IEP goals. Also quite useful for teachers who happen to teach multiple grade levels in one classroom, which we know teachers of students with significant needs frequently do. So this is helpful to see what are the main pieces of content given any particular content connector that a teacher may need to be hitting across that span of grade levels. You'll notice the color coding there. This is the priority I was talking about earlier. So depending on how often a content connector is likely to be assessed on the assessment, on the IAM assessment, that's how we've determined this color coding. And so anything that is purple, we consider to be high priority. It is for sure that content connector will be assessed at least once on the assessment. And then we go down from there. Ones that are blue are considered medium priority. There's a high likelihood that they'll appear somewhere on the assessment, but it's not for certain. And lastly, gray, it's a lesser priority, and yet still, like I mentioned earlier, all content connectors are important for instruction, and we don't want to leave those out. Again, thinking through, though, the priority of each content connector will help you know which ones might be most important to focus on in your IEP goal writing. So let's talk about unpacking these now. We know that content connectors are still quite rigorous because they are not meant to be easier versions of the Indiana Academic Standards. We also know that our students with more significant intellectual disabilities have quite a few challenges to overcome in accessing grade level standards. What we can do to help smooth that process is unpack a content connector. So these three blue bubbles here will guide you through the unpacking process as far as different areas to consider when you're breaking down that standard. First, you'll think about what skills are related and embedded within that content connector. The skills that are explicitly noted in that content connector and skills that may be necessary for that student to access the content within that content connector. Going around to the left side, you'll also be considering vocabulary, several different kinds of vocabulary. Core vocabulary, academic vocabulary, and assessment vocabulary. I have some examples here in just a minute that will make this a little bit more clear to you. And lastly, potentially most importantly, we're really going to be considering what's the functional application of content connectors that we're unpacking today. Content connectors are important for instruction. They're important to broaden a student's knowledge base, but there are some content connectors that may not be as applicable to a student's everyday functioning. So we really need to be aware of how a student may be able to apply even concepts that are covered under a particular content connector, whether that's related to employability, self-advocacy, or even just sort of independent participation within the community. Sometimes you have to get a little creative about how a content connector may be functionally applied. I often tell a story in my trainings where I had a high school teacher who was not super pleased with me about hearing, these high expectations and grade level content connectors. He really thought it was quite foolish that we needed to be teaching algebra to students with significant intellectual disabilities. His example was really all he wanted for his students was for them to be able to go to the bowling lane, pay for a game of a round of bowling, and know how much change they should get back. And I said, oh, actually, what we have here is a functional application of an algebra standard. Say the bowling game costs $6, you pay with a $10 bill. That student should know and be able to calculate how much change should I get back. That's finding an unknown, right? That X, that variable. So that's important to be able to think through how might a content connector be more functionally applied. This here is the Project Success Unpacking template for content connectors. It was based off of the Unpacking template for academic standards from IEPRC. And first, once you've listed the content connector there on the top, then you start breaking it down into what skills go into that content connector and what concepts go into that content connector. What should students be able to do and what should students know? Then, most importantly, I find this to be the most important box. What access skills are required for every student to master this grade level content connector? We'll talk here in a minute about why that idea of mastery is in there, mastery of grade level content, even though we have students with more significant needs. And then lastly, which access skills describe barriers for students' access to and progress toward this grade level content connector? Let's take a look at an example. This is a primary example of an unpacked content connector, a third grade reading literature content connector about describing characters in a story. Some of the skills that may be involved in describing characters in a story include being able to describe the character in the story, but more importantly, before a student can describe a character, they have to be able to identify that character. So those are a couple of the main skills that we've listed here that are related to describing characters in a story. Some of the concepts that a student may need to know or be familiar with in order to describe a character in a story. WH questions. We work with our students on WH questions all the time. But specifically here, we'd be targeting the who, because often when you're answering that question who, the answer could be a character when you're talking about a story. And also the WH question why, because this particular content connector calls out describing the character by naming traits, motivations, why, and feelings. Another concept that would be helpful for students to understand or receive more instruction in order to understand this is the idea of traits. We work with our students all the time, again, on being able to identify details, and all traits are specific details about a character. So really making that connections for students so that they understand they'll be telling details about a character. And lastly, the concept of feelings or emotions. Because this content connector calls out a character's feelings as a way to describe them, we can make that connection to the work that we do with our students on a daily basis, identifying their own emotions and understanding how to handle their own emotions. So let's look now at the access skills box. This box is asking what access skills are required for every student to master this grade level content connector. I want to talk about that question for just a second. This question is not implying that we expect every student to master every skill listed in this box to be able to reach mastery of the grade level content connector. What it is implying is that we're going to think through very intentionally every single skill that goes into a student being able to interact with and master the content connector that's listed here on the template. So students are at all different levels all the time, regardless of age or grade level. So we want to start with the very most basic access skills and then work our way up toward skills that are a little more closely aligned to the content connector. First here we have mode of communication. That is an essential access skill for literally any content connector that we have in Indiana. A student who is working on a mode of communication and strengthening a mode of communication or developing a mode of communication, that automatically says to us that they are working toward a skill that will increase their access to academic content. So that absolutely is an access skill that is aligned to any content connector that we could come up with. Another one would be listening and attending to either instruction or text, something like that. If the student is needing to work on their ability to listen and attend, whether that looks like a typically attending student, or maybe the student is pacing the room, pacing at the back of the room, but you know that they're still listening. That skill of listening and that skill of attending to what's going on is also a critical skill in being able to access academic content. That is a skill that is aligned to any academic content connector. But now we start getting into some skills that are a little more closely aligned to what's actually being addressed in the content connector here. Knowing the difference between people and objects. I mentioned earlier, in order to be able to describe a character, a student would first have to be able to identify that character. And some students that's the level that they're at, is being able to differentiate between people and objects. So if that's a skill that you're working on with them, that's a skill that is aligned to this grade level content connector of describing characters in a story. Now, that doesn't mean when you work on that skill of knowing the difference between people and objects that you have instructed in the content of that content connector describing characters in a story, but you certainly have worked on a skill that is aligned to being able to access it and brought them closer to being able to toward mastery of that content connector. Moving on from there, you'll see identifying relevant details. That goes right towards that traits idea of being able to describe character traits, categorizing, and then lastly, even being able to describe the character by stating a character's trait, motivation, or feeling. All of these skills, and probably more that aren't listed here, could be considered access skills towards reaching mastery of describing characters in a story. If you look at that last box there, which access skills describe barriers, this is going to be really individualized per student that you work with. Pretty much everything that we've done so far, reviewing through this template, could be unpacked pretty similarly, teacher to teacher. You come up with about the same ideas and information. But that last box is really going to be individualized to your students. What skill that you've listed there in that access skills box is really going to be the barrier for them reaching or obtaining further mastery of these skills. And that is where you might target an IEP goal. When you've gone through this process of thinking of all the access skills that could possibly be aligned to this grade level content connector, and then you are honing in on, this one is really going to be a barrier for my student, that's an indicator to you that it may be a good skill to include in an IEP goal. Let's take a look now at a secondary example of unpacking a content connector. It's the same process. You're going to break it down into skills and concepts that are related to that content connector, and then you'll start looking at the access skills that are required. Again, at the very base would be things like mode of communication, listening and attending, and then you'll get down into some of the skills that are more closely related. So this content connector happens to be cite the textual evidence that most strongly supports an analysis of what a text says explicitly. It's pretty heavy. But by going through this process of identifying all the access skills, breaking down all those skills, and listing them here in this access skills box, that will help you understand how a student with a significant disability can achieve some access to a skill that's aligned to that content connector. Again, things like mode of communication, listening and attending, those are the very most basic, but then we get into things like sequencing, breaking down the story into smaller parts. In order to be able to analyze a story or a piece of text, as this content connector is referring to, first you have to have a pretty solid base in sequencing. So if that's a skill that you're working on with a secondary student, to be able to sequence, break down a story, put it in order, that's a skill that's aligned to a grade level content connector. Retell, that's something we work on with our students frequently as well. Being able to take in content, whether through reading, through listening, through looking at pictures, and then being able to say or indicate in their own words, in their own way, what they have taken in, what information they've taken in. In this case, what we're wanting them to do is say what has happened explicitly, right? That's how this content connector is narrowing in on that. And then lastly, being able to cite text evidence by referring back to the text to find evidence of your answer when you're answering that question. So again, you can see the progression of the skills going from the very most basic all the way down to the most closely aligned. And again, the bottom box is there to consider what might be barriers for particular students. Again, the process is the same, whether it's primary or secondary. The important thing to know when you're unpacking content connectors, though, is always choose the grade level content connector to unpack. If you have an 8th grade student who's functioning perhaps at a 4th grade level, You're not going to pick the 4th grade content connector and unpack that because you haven't provided access to that 8th grade level content by doing that. You'll always head for the grade level content connector, and then as you're working on breaking down all of those skills, that's where you're going to see and find the skills that are at that student's ability level. Enough of that. Let's get to actually writing IEP goals now aligned to content connectors. So first, let's think briefly about the IEP process. We know that we start with present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. That's information about students' abilities in academics as well as functional areas, and it really needs to be thorough and accurate. Then that cycles around to using that information to write these measurable annual goals. And finally, once those goals are written, we're then going to spend the rest of that IEP process progress monitoring students' progress toward those measurable annual goals that we've identified. Let's take a closer look. When you're thinking about writing a measurable annual goal, this is a great reference of all the different pieces that might go into it to make sure that it's clear and addresses all the pieces that it needs to address. There needs to be a condition. Under what condition will the student perform this goal or this skill that's being addressed in the goal? There needs to be a clearly defined skill or behavior. And then we list some performance criteria. The level that they have to demonstrate for mastery, how well do they have to do it in order for it to be considered mastered? The number of times that may need to be demonstrated in order to be considered mastered, or across how much time. And then how often will you actually check in to see how that progress is going? And what method will you be using? So at the bottom row there, given something, whatever the condition is, he or she will do this target skill or behavior this well to this degree, this many days or times or across this much time span, as measured using this progress monitoring tool. Hopefully it'll make more sense as we keep going, but I find this to be a good reference when you're thinking through all the pieces that need to be included in a measurable annual goal. Really important 2 things to keep in mind about measurable annual goals. 1, the focus is on access to and participation in general education at increasingly higher levels of independence. We want to make sure that the goals that we choose to write in an IEP are aimed at increasing a student's access to general education and their participation in general education, whether that's the curriculum, the content, the setting, the peers. All of this is aimed at getting our students more and more involved in general education. Secondly, the important thing to think about well-written annual goals is that they address identified deficits that when we intervene, when we provide some kind of intervention and supports in that area, would reduce the adverse impact of the student's disability on their mastery of standards. Another way of saying that is we want to choose a goal that once we work on it and a student gets better at it, it has done something to improve their ability to access or master standards. So let's talk about characteristics of measurable goals. What might be included in such a thing? They're driven by accurate and thorough present levels. I mentioned that earlier. Really important that we're updating those present levels anytime we have a case conference, and that they're thorough. We're not just making general statements, but that we're really digging in and listing information about the skills and abilities of the student. The measurable goals need to be aligned to grade level standards or alternate standards. Again, if a student is an 8th grade student is performing at a 4th grade level, the goal itself needs to be aligned to an 8th grade standard. But that's why we're unpacking. We're not going to write the goal at an 8th grade level. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But we are going to align it to a standard that is at that student's grade level. A measurable annual goal should describe one specific skill or behavior. Otherwise, it becomes impossible to progress monitor. The more skills and behaviors you start including in one measurable annual goal, the more things you have to progress monitor, the more complicated it becomes to determine whether a student has reached mastery or not. So we really want it to be on one specific skill or behavior. Has to be easily progress monitored in order to be able to keep track on how things are going. If it's too much of a process and procedure to keep progress monitoring on this, it won't happen, and then we won't know if they're reaching the goal or not. The goal has to be clearly written and understood by all. This is a tricky one sometimes because teachers, it's easy to fall into a trap of, you know your student, you're with them daily, you understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and everything in between. And so when you write the goal, you know what you mean because you wrote the goal. But keep in mind, one, that there are going to be other staff members who are reading this IEP and need to understand what the goals really are. And two, there could be situations where a student moves out of your district and the IEP will travel to another district. That district won't have any of that background knowledge of that student. So making sure that you write the goal as if you're describing it to someone who has no background knowledge of that student is really important. It has to be clearly written and understood by all. All right, we have steps for goal writing. It looks so easy here, doesn't it? As we tackle each step individually and think about what it means. So first, you'll determine the present levels. Next, you'll identify the target skill or behavior. So far, so good, I think. Number 3, determine the conditions. Again, going back to what we looked at before, the conditions are given this or under this condition, here's when or where or how this student will be performing this skill or behavior. And then lastly, after you've done all those other things, is when you'll think about, now how will I know what those mastery criteria are? What methods will I be using to collect data? And then across what time period will I be collecting that data? Step 1, determine present levels. We've already talked about this a bit, but just to give this very clear, concise definition, the IEP describes the student's current level of academic achievement and functional performance, including strengths, areas of need, and the impact of their disability or disabilities on the student's progress. All 3 of those things should be included in a solid statement of present levels. We need to know and understand what a student's strengths are so that we can use those and build on them in order to be able to work on areas of need. Obviously, an IEP exists to make sure that we're addressing areas of need. So those need to be listed quite clearly. And then also we need to know the disabilities that this student has. How is that impacting their progress toward general education content and their participation in a general education setting? All things we need to target within an IEP. This is just a brief list of some of the data sources you may use to get information for your present levels. It can be anywhere from data that is more academically based from some kind of assessment all the way to things that are taken daily for every student, such as attendance or rubrics, classwork, formative assessments. Really, the sky's the limit as far as what kinds of things you can use to get information for those present levels. Identifying the target skill or behavior. Once you have down all that great information, that really solid, rich information about a student's strengths, areas of need, and the impact that their disability has, now you'll get to identifying the target skill or behavior. We've sort of reviewed some of this already. I think one thing that's really important to remember is that whatever target skill or behavior you choose, one, we've already talked about it needs to be just one, but also you need to make sure that it is something you can observe easily, that it's measurable, and that it's repeatable. It can't just be a one-time thing because then they've met it, but you can't find a way to verify that they're able to do it again, right? This needs to be a skill that would be performed over and over again. And then obviously it should be based on the specific barriers that a student has. A skill or behavior in an IEP goal should not contain multiple skills or behaviors, shouldn't be vague or open to interpretation, and it shouldn't be unrelated to a student's current needs. So that goes back to that idea of writing an IEP goal at grade level. If that's unrelated to the student's needs at that time, to write something that is that close to grade level, don't do it. But you can break down the standard to find the skills that a student needs to work on to master, to be able to slowly make progress toward a grade level standard. Consider what data collection methods you might use to gather accurate data about the target skill or behavior. We're not going to list it now in terms of this IEP goal development process. It's really important to think through ahead of time, how am I going to track progress toward this skill or this behavior? Because if you decide on the goal ahead of time, you decide on the skill, and then you get to the point of actually having to progress monitor and you find, oh, I actually am not sure how I'm going to find out whether a student is performing this skill or not, or to what degree they're performing this skill. So it is important to think through that process ahead of time. This is a nice reference slide here, thinking through some words that indicate more vague skills that you'll want to stay away from when writing an IEP goal, and then some words that would indicate more clearly defined skills that would be more appropriate to use when writing an IEP goal. Things like understanding or recognizing, communicating, those are skills that they're important skills, but they're a little bit more tricky to know exactly how do we know if a student understands something? How do we know if a student is communicating something? So that's an opportunity to be more specific. Are they communicating verbally? Are they communicating by pointing? Are they communicating by whatever? So you'll see there on the right-hand side, these are a little bit more clear. We can understand what it means when we say the student states something or the student matches something, right? That's a more clear skill. So think about using this slide as a reference as you're writing your IEP goals in the future. Here are some examples sort of in practice of what a vague statement might look like as opposed to something that's a little bit more clear. So we'll understand money concepts. Certainly an important skill that we want our students to be working on, understanding money concepts. But that is going to be really vague in terms of how will we know if a student has mastered understanding money concepts? How will we progress monitor whether a student has been understanding money concepts, and so forth. So something that's a little more clear is we'll orally count nickels, dimes, and quarters up to $2. We've named that it's going to be oral counting. We've named the specific coins, nickels, dimes, and quarters, and we've sort of given it a limit of up to $2. That really helps narrow down what we're talking about here. And you'll see in the rest of this table here additional examples of what's vague and what would be a little bit more clear way to write it. Short-term objectives. We've been talking a lot about measurable annual goals so far, but we all know that underneath there can be some short-term objectives. So I think it's important to clarify what short-term objectives are in an IEP and what they're not. So let's think about short-term objectives as skills that need to be directly taught, not something that is an accommodation or sort of a way around getting to whatever that measurable annual goal is targeting. It's really sort of a skill that needs to be directly taught that supports what's happening in that measurable annual goal. A short-term objective describes a student behavior that demonstrates understanding and application of skills. It's not naming some kind of intervention, what you'll be doing to intervene or provide support, or a particular kind of curricular program that you're using to address the goal. That's not what objectives are for. And lastly, and I think most importantly when we're talking about objectives, a short-term objective should be something that is a separate skill that's required to meet a goal. It's a piece of how a student will meet the measurable annual goal. It's not a projected timeline of mastery aligned to progress reporting. I made that mistake when I was a teacher. I see many people doing that now. It seems to be a nice way of breaking down short-term objectives. We'll reach this amount of mastery by this time of the year. We'll reach this mastery by this time of the year. That's a good way to think through it and sort of pace yourself, but that's not where we're going to put that information in short-term objectives. It really needs to be the skills, almost like the sub-skills, to reaching whatever skill or behavior is listed in that measurable annual goal. All right, let's determine some conditions here. Here are just a few examples of conditions that you may use when writing an IEP goal. Not going to review all of them, but this gives you a pretty clear picture of what it might look like when you're saying a student's going to perform this skill or this behavior that you've identified. Well, under what conditions? Well, it might be when they've been given written instructions or given verbal prompts. I would get a little more specific with that too. What kind of verbal prompt? Given a calculator, provided a vocabulary list. So under what conditions? They're going to have this going on around them when they're expected to perform this skill or behavior. And lastly, step 4 in this process is determining the mastery criteria. How will we know when a student has mastered it? And then the data collection period. We're going to talk a little bit more about data collection in here as well. So mastery criteria is the degree that's considered to be acceptable for an IEP goal. It doesn't literally mean mastery 100%, right? It's for an IEP goal, when we're thinking about what the mastery criteria is, it may be something like 60%. That doesn't mean they've mastered that entire skill, but that's what we've deemed to be acceptable for that student given that skill. Again, with everything in IEPs, needs to be clear and measurable, this mastery criteria. It should be ambitious, but it should also be realistic. We're not going for 100% of the time. We're not going for 10 times out of 10 times. No one is perfect. No one really can always get to 10 out of 10. and things like that. So we need to make room and allow our students to have that same room for error that non-disabled students would have in general education. The mastery criteria should be determined by current baseline data. So if you have baseline that's showing a student is performing this skill at, let's say 20%, we're not going to up it to 80% within one year of writing this measurable annual goal. So it really needs to be, the criteria needs to be determined by what's currently going on with that student regarding that skill. The mastery criteria can be stated in terms of accuracy, how accurately a student is performing the skill or behavior, how often it occurs, or how long it occurs, the duration. It's not a grade level or a subjective measure, so we're not in our mastery criteria going to say they will reach a particular grade level, and that's considered mastery. We're going to stay away from that. A few examples are listed here: a percentage of accuracy, or the percentage of time something occurs, the number of trials or opportunities that it occurs, or perhaps the number of minutes that a behavior has a duration for. These are just a couple examples, both for academic goals and behavior or executive function goals, what the accuracy or what the mastery criteria might look like in each of those types of goals. So you'll see in the academic goals, we're looking at with an 80% accuracy, and or perhaps on 3 out of 5 opportunities. And then for behavior or executive functioning, it's in 4 out of 5 measured trials or 95% of school days. These are specific statements that let us know when we will consider that student to have mastered the skill that's listed here. These goals that are here, I would not say are exemplar goals. Please don't model your goals after what's listed here. This is solely to be pointing out what the mastery criteria might be in this instance. The data collection period, this one's pretty straightforward. It's the expected timeline for reaching the goal. Again, has to be clearly stated, and it's going to be based on that anticipated rate of growth. Same thing I was mentioning earlier. If they're starting it with a 20% accuracy right now, we're not going to bump it all the way up to 80% within a year. That doesn't make sense. Maybe they'll get to 80% in 5 years, but that's not really what this is about, right? A measurable annual goal is annual, so we need to keep it under that in that year time frame. This is a nice chart that describes some different data collection methods, what they are, what they might be measuring or using to measure, and then what kind of code you might be using to record student responses. So the 3 main ones that we see frequently would be event recording, so literally recording when an event happens, that is the skill or behavior you're targeting. You're going to be counting or tallying each time that occurs. That might be a number of events that you're recording. It might be a rate at which the events are occurring, or again, a percentage of time that it's happening. And that's either going to come out as a number, or it may be sort of a plus or minus rate. It's happening at this rate or a negative rate or so forth. Trial recording is another data collection method where you're going to record the level of support that's needed or provided for the student to be able to perform whatever skill or task skill or behavior is being looked at in that time. Again, can be a number or percentage. And lastly, total duration. So recording the time between when that behavior or that skill starts and when it stops, and then how long that is. And maybe you want that to be increasing, maybe you want it to be decreasing. The data should be collected on a regular basis for all annual goals and short-term objectives to ensure that the student is making progress that's sufficient to meet the goal. If you set a measurable annual goal in October and you don't check in on the progress that student's making until February, March, April, May, or heaven forbid, right before the next case conference in October, there won't be any time for you to adjust what you've been doing with your instruction, your specially designed instruction, other kinds of supports you've been providing. There won't be time for you to adjust, and that's just lost time in terms of what supports we can provide for students to be making improvements toward meeting that goal. Also, keep in mind the data that you're collecting as part of this progress monitoring process can be used to inform and develop the present levels for the next IEP. So this isn't just collecting data for the purpose of progress monitoring. You'll also be able to sort of archive that and then use that to inform the present levels for your next IEP. Project Success has a goal writing template. It's hyperlinked in this PowerPoint presentation and is also available on our website. It does a nice job of walking you through the steps that we've talked about today, as well as some sort of sub-steps in between there as well. Let's look at it in a little more detail as far as what a goal might look like. This is an academic goal. I've got a measurable annual goal up there on top, and then a couple of objectives that might be listed underneath. This will help sort of differentiate between what do we mean when we're talking about a measurable annual goal, and what do we mean when we're talking about short-term objectives. Again, these are just examples. I wouldn't consider these exemplars or templates for you to then kind of remove words and put in your own words. It's more to make a broader point of here's what a goal might be phrased like, and here are what some objectives might look like. Given environmental or functional words, Allison will read 40 words with 80% accuracy on 5 consecutive weekly probes. If you think through some of the pieces that we've talked about earlier today, you'll see the conditions given environmental or functional words. I would even narrow that down a bit more. That's a little vague, but the conditions are definitely there. Allison will read 40 words with 80% accuracy. So that 40 words piece, that's the skill that we're doing. We're reading the words. The 80% accuracy, that's the mastery criteria. And then that data collection period, 5 consecutive weekly probes. Now, in order to be able to read those words with 80% accuracy, what are some of those skills that Allison's going to be needing to do? She's going to be given, in this first objective, environmental or functional pictures, photos, or symbols, and then match those to a given word with 90% accuracy. So that's a skill that isn't exactly reading the words like the goal is targeting, but it's something that's going to lead her to be able to eventually read the words, right? We're working on a skill that will provide access to that ultimate measurable annual goal. And then the other objective, given pairs of environmental or functional words that begin and end with the same letters, Allison will match the pairs with 95% accuracy. So again, it's not a skill that is the entire goal, but it's a piece. It's something that when you work on that, that will provide support toward reaching that ultimate measurable annual goal. This would be an example of a functional goal, what the annual goal might look like, and then some objectives underneath it. Again, as you look through this, I won't read it out to you. I think you all can read it yourselves, but you can see and pick out the different elements of a measurable annual goal. You see the conditions. You see a clear skill that's being targeted, transitioning to the next activity. How are we going to know when she's successful? Because it's going to take no more than 2 verbal prompts within 5 minutes. And what's that mastery criteria? It'll happen on 8 out of 10 consecutive school days. Once that's happened, we don't need to go for 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. 8 out of 10 is what we're aiming for here. What are some ways that we're going to get there with these short-term objectives? She'll match the symbol to the activity. So that goes along with being able to transition, having a symbol that represents that activity and being able to match it. And then also being given at least 5 different 2-step visual directions. Allison will follow those directions in order with no more than 1 verbal prompt, etc. So being given these different 2-step directions and then being able to follow those directions, that's going to assist in the process of making that transition that's targeted in that annual goal. Quality check. We always want to do a quality check after we've developed an annual goal. 2 big main important things. 1, does each goal that you've written pass that stranger test? What we talked about earlier, this student may be going to a different district at some point. This student may, as they go on from elementary to middle to high school and so forth, they'll be getting new teachers throughout their educational career. Will those people understand exactly what you mean for each of those goals that you've developed? And then secondly, can the question of mastery be answered with a yes or no? If you can't read that goal and say, did the student master this? Yes or no? Then it's a little too complicated and we have to figure out a way to simplify it and really clarify those mastery criteria. You should be able to say a student has mastered a goal or has not mastered a goal. Some additional resources here. We have an IEPRC goals development checklist, as well as sort of a supporting short share video from the IDOE. The IDOE also did a coffee talk on goals, about 20 minutes long. The link is there. You can also find it on the DOE's website. And lastly, we have a spread the word on specially designed instruction. That's something that's really going to be helpful in supporting your writing of IEP goals. Lastly, just to wrap up, once you've watched this webinar, we'll have an opportunity to have open office hours where you can call in. That'll give you an opportunity to ask questions and hear from teachers who have been doing good work in this area of writing IEP goals. So if you have more questions after watching this webinar today, that'll be a great opportunity to have those questions answered. If you have any additional questions about IEP goal writing or anything else related to students with significant disabilities, please feel free to reach out to Project Success. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.